So I'm joined today by Dr. Ankur Barua. Dr. Barua is a lecturer of Hindu studies in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. He's also my former PhD supervisor, and I'm really glad that he's able to join us today to speak about Advaita Vedanta. We've written together, we've written this kind of booklet introducing people to Advaita Vedanta, which the students in my class have read the vast majority of that booklet. But Ankur, I was wondering, could we start by hearing just a little more about who you are? In my class, we've read a couple of your poems as well. We've looked through your website, The Itinerant Recluse. But I wondered if you could just share with us who you are, what's your background, how did you come to study Hinduism, Christianity, and the other things that you are studying and researching and teaching about lately.
Thank you, Nadya, for inviting me to speak to you and to your students about some of the things I study and teach and research. Regarding who I am, as Nadya has pointed out, I give lectures on Hinduism mainly, sometimes on Buddhism as well at the Faculty of Divinity at Cambridge, where I teach. How did I get interested in these kinds of things? Actually, I came to the study of religion through some long-winded paths. My first degree was in physics, and various things happened when I was about 18 years old, 19 years old, 10, 20 years old, which gradually, step by step, took me into the study of the history of religion, the philosophy of religion. And given the fact that we don't really study religion as a subject at school, when I meet young people who are about 18 years old who say, I know that I want to study religion, I'm always amazed. I mean, how could you know this? And not just amazed, I'm also very deeply impressed. Because when I was 18 years old, that was the last thing on my mind, to study religion. I wanted to do things like theoretical physics and other things. However, now that I look back, I think one of the reasons that ultimately pushed me step by step, maybe even subconsciously, unself-consciously, was the fact that when I was a very little boy, I grew up in a family which is largely Hindu, but some members of that wider extended family are Christian, Roman Catholic, and Muslim. And it just so happens, when I was a very little boy, I spent most of my time with my Christian and my Muslim relatives. And when I was growing up, I had the usual questions about who am I? Am I really a Hindu? Or am I really a Christian who's trying to be Hindu? Or am I really a Hindu who's listening to what Christians say? And partly, some of these questions about identity, which I think are much more important to us when we are 18 years old than now. These questions don't really trouble me. Okay.
Maybe one other question there is, because we have looked at the website of yours and we have looked at a couple of your poems. I'm thinking of the Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, I Don't Wonder What You Are. Could you say, maybe these are more recent writings, the stuff on your website and the kind of nursery rhyme type poetry. Could you tell us a little bit about what's brought you into that style of work or that content of work?
One straightforward way to answer your question is that I have for some years now been, and by some years I would say maybe 10 years, even 20 years, trying to formulate a style of writing, a way of thinking where I am very precise and concise in what I say and how I write, but keeping in mind that precision is never sufficient to really understand life, right? So this is this kind of dialectic, almost just kind of a dilemma. On the one hand, I like to think very clearly, very precisely, very concisely. But the more clearly you think, the more you are going to lose out on life. I mean, because life is never just so clear. I mean, social reality is always much messier than what we can report in our language. And yet I want that language, which is very crystal clear. And therefore, I think I often write in the form of fairy tales, parables, rhymes, making fun of my own attempt to be very clear and precise and concise. So it's a kind of a self-deprecatory mode in which I sometimes write poems, which of course I can't publish in peer-reviewed journals. I can't send them to my publishers. So I said, okay, If you want to let me publish these things in my books, I mean, I still have other channels. So maybe that's one reason why I write these kinds of slightly irreverent talks. How do I communicate Advaita Vedanta to you? The essence, so to speak, the quintessence, the basic spirit of Advaita straight away.
Yeah.
So that's the challenge. And therefore, as I said, I mean, thank you for inviting me to throwing down the gauntlet like that and inviting me to take on the challenge. So let me rise to the challenge by saying, let's speak the language of experience, right? I mean, even if we have not read books, even if we are not familiar with the characteristic idioms of a worldview, even if you are not familiar with the philosophical, metaphysical, cosmological foundations, human experience is, let's say, relatively more shareable, relatively more transcultural, maybe not absolutely universal, but that's why I say transcultural, if not universal. So I'm going to give you two examples of situations or events which I would characterize as an Advaita-like feel, an Advaita-like experience. But before I get there, let me just tell you what Advaita is. So very literally speaking, the word Advaita simply means not two-ness. This claim that although I seem to inhabit a library with 20,000 books, with 45 people, and maybe 3 cats in the garden, so there is a multiplicity, there's diversity, at the most basic, fundamental, foundational level of reality, there is a not-to-ness. So think of this not-to-ness like a golden chain of being, or like a thread of being that interconnects all the seemingly disconnected things that we see. Right? So the world is not sheer multiplicity, one thing after another after another. There's a deeper, let's say, method to the madness, and the name of that method is Advaita. So this is the deep glue, the connecting thread, the connecting bond, so that things are not just flying apart in 100 million different directions. There's a center of gravity which is holding things together, and that feeling of not two-ness is Advaita. And bear in mind that I'm not translating not two-ness as just one or unity, not yet. So the claim is not that I and my laptop are one, full stop. I mean, you may say, well, that's not possible because my laptop here is in front of me and I am here. How can I and my dog be one? How can I and the library be one? So the claim is not so much unity, not yet, but at the very least, this negative claim, not two-ness. Whatever the relationship may be between me and my library, I don't know how to spell it out. But at the very least, the claim is there is a fundamental not-to-ness. Okay, so that's all we will say about the meaning of the word not-to-ness. Now here come the two examples. Suppose on the, let's say the 15th of June next year, 2022, you were standing somewhere on the seashore of Canada, somewhere on the west coast or the east coast. And let's say it is 5 a.m. in the morning. And this is what you see. You see a tiny speck of the sun just rising steadily above the horizon of the sea. And as you keep on meditating on, or even contemplating on this tiny yellow-orange disk, which is gently gliding up into the sky, this is what's going to happen to you, because I'm telling you it will happen to you for 3 seconds. For 3 seconds, you feel that the sun has become you, you have become the sun, the sea waves have become you, you have become the sea waves, that you have, as it were, contained within yourself the entire sky, and the sky has absorbed you into it. So that for those 3 very fleeting, however, moments, you feel that you are caught up in the seamless flow of experience, where all distinctions between internal and external, inner and outer have dissolved, have broken down, and you are within this vast, seamless, unbroken flow of experience. Unfortunately, or fortunately, this will last only for 3 seconds. But those 3 seconds are a very human, imperfect analogy or a pointer to what Advaita is about. It's not so much a lie, because as we will see, maybe this will come up later, Advaita cannot really be described or stated. I can't say the cat is ... or the dog is ... Likewise, Advaita is ... Advaita, I can only point to with my finger, intimate or indicate by adding in all kinds of negative claims. It is not this, it is not this. Therefore, when I say you may feel like this for 3 seconds, the claim is not that that is Advaita. You have somehow pinned it down. This is a human imperfect analogy. So that's one. And here's another one. Let's say you go to Paris next summer again, and you go to this famous library called the Louvre, where you have the Mona Lisa. And you're standing in front of the Mona Lisa, and you become completely wrapped in attention, beholding the Mona Lisa. And so completely engrossed you become in in beholding, in observing the beautiful painting, that only when somebody walks up to you from behind you and taps you on the shoulder and says, "Sir or madam, time to close up," you realize that for maybe 1 minute or 10 seconds, you had become completely absorbed into the Mona Lisa, and the Mona Lisa had become part of the very fabric of your being. So the normal, customary dichotomy or distinction between perceiver, perceived, cognizer, cognized had become effaced, or it had broken down. So again, there was no you called an observer observing a painting of the Mona Lisa, but you and the Mona Lisa became part of this not-to-ness, this big, or maybe not really big, but this unbroken flow of not-to-ness. Now, the examples I've given you, you may not have had precisely these examples, I mean, standing on a seashore or going to the Louvre, but I would be surprised if you have never, ever felt something, even if vaguely similar to these kinds of experiences, where you feel that it is just it. There is no structure, there is no distinction between inner and outer, external or internal. It could be when you're listening to your favorite song, right? When you're listening to your favorite song, you don't feel that you are listening to the song is you, and you are the song. And with just these two analogies, let's simply say this for now, that is the best possible. I mean, that may be all that we can do in terms of analogies in trying to point to Advaita. Mm-hmm. So that would be my initial attempt at responding to the challenge.
Thank you. It reminds me a lot of flow states. So there's, in the last 5 or maybe even 10 years, there's been more literature coming out about flow, mostly in athletic and in artist or musician in particular communities, where individuals can enter what has been termed a flow state, where in that state you're not feeling the way you are when you're out of it. You're very much more connected to what it is you're doing, almost to the point some people would describe where they've lost that sense of self that we often carry around with us, right? When you're in flow, you're caught up so much so in what it is you're doing, whether that's running a marathon, whether that's writing a song or playing a song or listening to a song. And I think that also is maybe an example external to religious experiences that we could draw from when we're trying to describe this kind of not-to-ness.
Yeah, I mean the two examples I gave you, I mean, I did not have in mind anything to do with Advaita. You know, it was just very common experiences one could have on a seashore or in a museum or in a gallery. And to talk about your what you said about flow. So again, let's think about how does one become an accomplished singer or a dancer. So initially, you are going to struggle a lot because there are rules, there are norms. You have to be disciplined into these norms which are external to you. It may take you 3 years, in some cases, maybe 15 years. But after a while, these norms become so completely internalized that you don't even realize you are playing out norms when you're dancing or singing. I mean, you become the song. So it's not you waking up one morning and say, okay, that thing called a song out there in the other room. I have to go and check it out and listen to it and sing it. You just start singing because you are the song.
Mm-hmm. And that happens, which we might return to later on, that happens with expertise and with practice. And I think when people first begin, let's say, meditation practices or any other kind of practice that they might take up in kind of a desire to achieve or to experience this kind of non-dual state or non-dual experience, they sometimes forget how much time it can actually take to bring us there. But I'm bringing us a little off of where I want us to go. So I'll return us to the topic with a question about stepping maybe one more step into explaining or articulating Advaita. How does Advaita explain the relationship between, or even the difference between, the concepts of Brahman and Atman?
Before we get to this question of Brahman and Atman, let's have some kind of, as it were, ground rules regarding what we mean by Atman and Brahman. The only difficulty regarding having ground rules about Atman and Brahman is that, these are concepts which cannot be described or spelled out in human words or human language. But let's try anyway. So what we mean by Atman is more or less, actually less more than more, but even so more or less, the conscious principle of, say, subjectivity. So I'm a conscious being. I'm speaking to you. I have something called awareness, unlike, let's say, possibly my laptop is not aware. Let's assume it is so. So I'm aware, and I have something called self-reflexivity. So I can reflect on myself in this way. I know that I know. I know that I'm speaking to you, right? So this is what's called self-reflexivity. And let's again assume that my laptop is not capable of this kind of self-reflexivity. Whether animals are capable of self-reflexivity is an interesting question. We would like to ponder on it later on. But for now, let's just focus on human beings. We have self-reflexivity, we have conscious awareness, and more or less, that is what we mean by Atman. I again highlight the more or less because what Advaita means by Atman is not this I who is speaking to you, but that I, which I was trying to point in a while ago when I was talking about that quote-unquote experience on the seashore, when all differences between subject and object, subjectivity, objectivity collapsed and imploded and broke down. But how do we get to that from the I who is speaking to you right now? So from this I, which is bounded, which is limited in space and time. So right now I'm in England, and that time is, let's say, 3 p.m. So it is bounded, it is limited, it has certain constraints. But that Atman, beyond time, beyond space, beyond all boundaries, limitations, has no such constriction. So that is that Atman. So think of that Atman like the pure sunlight, pure luminosity, just light, right? So let's say, to slightly use anthropomorphic language, that is language in which we try to think of non-human objects as human. The sun does not wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning and say, okay, it's 5 a.m. in the morning now, I need to shine my light on Mars and Jupiter and Earth, right? For the sun, there's no inside and outside. The sun does not have a sun in itself and shining for the other. Sunlight is just light, just is. And think of this Atman, this light of consciousness, which is always shining without worrying about, okay, am I shining because Ankur is talking or Nadya is listening or you are thinking? So it's not light which is limited to you or me or somebody else. This light just is. So think of this conscious self, and then, as it were, try to go one step higher or deeper. What is the basis? What is the foundation of this conscious self which is speaking to you, and call that Atman? Okay, Brahman is slightly easier in some respects. Suppose, well, I mean, if you're in my room right now, I will show you the tree in the garden, and I would say, look at the tree in the garden. Right now, there are leaves in the garden. And after 4 months, there will be no leaves in the garden on that tree in January. Would you say that the tree itself had changed? While you are welcome to answer the question in your own way, let me preempt the answer by saying you will say no. You will say that the tree has not changed. It is the same tree. Although right now the tree has leaves, and in February the tree does not have leaves, the tree itself does not change. So what is the presupposition when we talk like this? That it is possible to mark out or identify change only against a background of relative stability and permanence. If absolutely everything were changing all the time, we would not even be able to say, here is a laptop to which I'm speaking, right? So it is not the case that absolutely everything is changing all the time, but some things are changing relative to a background which is more stable. Now, suppose I carry out this experiment and keep on going as it were deeper and deeper and deeper into reality. The reason why it is the same tree, because the garden has not changed. The reason why the garden has not changed, because the Milky Way has not changed. The reason why the Milky Way has not changed is because, let's say, something else has not changed. And let's say we hit some kind of bedrock and say, okay, here the spade cannot dig any deeper, and here is the hard rock. And that, of course, I mean, this is an analogy. I mean, there's no hard rock or Brahman anywhere. But let's say we keep on using this analogy, that hard rock beyond which we cannot go is the Brahman, right? Now, so far so good. And here is the truly incredible claim of Advaita. I mean, it's incredible if you are hearing this for the first time, that I, and by I here, I don't mean the I who is speaking to you, the true I, this Atman is not two with the garden, with the Milky Way, with the cosmos, with you, with this laptop, with absolutely everything. So I may mistakenly think of myself as this tiny, finite, puny human being who's subject to suffering, death, ignorance, misery. I have headaches and toothaches and all kinds of aches all the time. That is my misconception. Because I'm misidentifying my I with the I which is bounded to this physical frame, which has a name and a form. So the true me, the true I, is that Atman, which I was trying to point, intimate, not describe. And that Atman is not two, it's not one more thing over and above this Brahman. And that is the not two-ness between all of us, every human being, every cow, dog, cat, laptop, tree, garden, and the basic, unchanging, timeless foundation of the universe. Right? So one implication of this is, and then I will stop. We'll move to the next question. One implication of this is that we may, if we accept this vision, we may feel secure and safe in the heart of being. The world is not some kind of an alien place. We truly, in the most deepest sense possible, belong here, right? That this universe is not some kind of a domain to which we have been exiled. We are not cosmic exiles in this world, but the world is not true from our deepest foundation. And you will find some people who practice Advaita who will say that this thought gives them this kind of security, a kind of a cosmic feeling of belongingness, that no matter how pointless, meaningless the universe may look like, when you look at the world, there is chaos and anarchy and disorder and suffering and death all the time, yet they gain this kind of a security, a feeling of being at peace with one's own true self, that Atman, which is not two with Brahman. So that is what this Advaita, not two-ness, is. Not between me, this I who is speaking to you, and Brahman, but the deep self, for which you can use terms like, if you want, like transcendental self or over self, is not two. It's not the easiest thing to state in words. That's why I started off with those experiences. Right? So if you feel lost, you just think of yourself on the seashore, and that is it. That is the not-two-ness.
Thank you. I think it's also really helpful to hear how that can offer comfort for people. If you can think of, okay, if my experience of reality and my understanding of myself in relation to these alleged others is actually one of connectedness, one of not two-ness, there can be a great peace and a great comfort that comes from that. That being said, it can also be, as we're both well aware of, as we've written about, as we've discussed many times in our own conversations, like that is an extremely challenging thought to inhabit and live out, because, as Advaita also teaches, we experience reality quite differently than that a lot of the time, right? We experience the separation, we experience the separateness, we experience the feeling of the self in which, I am this being in this body, I end here. We experience the world in a very different way. And of course, Advaita has explanations for this, or it has ways of describing why it is we experience the world that way. but that the fact that that is how we experience the world can make it very challenging to simultaneously embrace an understanding of the world in which we are not two, in which we are connected. One analogy that we wrote into the booklet is one of whirlpools emerging in a stream of water. So how we wrote about it is that, you know, there can be a stream of water that is flowing, and in the middle of that stream, a small whirlpool, just a very tiny one, kind of begins to circle around, and maybe there's another one over here. And these whirlpools, if we were to also give them human characteristics, you know, they might think of themselves as an independent entity. They might think, you know, I'm a whirlpool, like this is how I operate, and you know, my start is here, my end is here, my cycle of motion is in this way, and this other whirlpool over here, if it were to have human thought and human ways of thinking, might go, well, I'm a whirlpool over here, and I move in this way. This is my beginning. This is my end. If we were to look at that whole picture, we actually see that the whirlpools are not separate. They are not two. They are not separate from the pool of water in which they are, in which they came into existence and in which they continue to live out their existence. And in fact, one day they might no longer be a whirlpool at all, right? At one point, that whirlpool might take shape back into the stream of water. We use this analogy to talk about the concept of Maya, and the way that Advaita, you know, speaks of Maya. I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit more about the concept of Maya as Advaita portrays it, and how that relates also to the concept of enlightenment as Advaita portrays it.
Yeah, so you know, the concept of Maya is one of the most famous or infamous concepts that has come out of South Asia, or like forms of Hinduism, because partly the problem relates to translation. Many of these terms in Sanskrit and modern Indian languages do not have precise correlates or equivalents in English. Here's another example. There's this extremely polyvalent term called dukkha, which we usually translate as suffering. And suffering is not a bad translation either, but there are various kind of shades of meaning to suffering, to dukkha, which may or may not be captured by suffering, depending on what you mean by suffering. So, say pain, torment, anxiety, unease, disease, dissatisfactoriness. If all of that is what you mean by suffering, then suffering is not a bad translation for dukkha. But if that is so, right? If your understanding of suffering is broad enough to encompass that whole experiential continuum. Likewise, Maya does not have, say, one precise English translation, but often you will find the translation illusion, which again is not a bad translation, because what Maya is trying to get at is the sense that things are not what they seem to be. So in one sense, Maya is just that. All that glitters is not gold. So that's the claim, right? So if you think that well, whatever I see in front of me is a Brahman, full stop, then Maya is the claim that all that seems to be Brahman is not so. So if I may claim that I am absolutely, ultimately real, I'm this completely independent, autonomous being, and I derive my existence from myself, I generate my momentum of being, I can go on with my own self-derived momentum, left to my own devices, I will do just fine. So that misconception, that illusion is one name for Maya. And that is why the analogy, which is used in many classical, pre-modern, traditional Advaita texts, is that of the sea wave and the sea. So think of the sea wave as representing the great ocean, the sea as representing the great ocean of being. And you and I, this I who is speaking to you, you who is listening to me, they who are observing us, so this I. Then again, the laptop, the dog, and the cat. These are so many ripples, these are so many wavelets which arise, come into being, and pass away on the great sea of being. But the sea of being remains unexhausted, right? And it cannot be exhausted by our coming into being or our passing away. Because what is really, really real, truly true, is not the waves, but the sea. So here's a pre-modern verse which says this, that it is not the case that the ocean says to the wave, I belong to you, but it is the wave that says to the ocean, I belong to you. Right? So if the ocean were to be removed somehow, all the waves would disappear. But it is perfectly possible to think of a completely placid, tranquil surface of a lake or an ocean, right, where there are no waves, no ripples, no wavelets. So a wavelet or a ripple or a wave exists only insofar as its basis, namely the sea, exists. So it derives its being, its existence, its reason for being from the foundation of the sea, and it is not the other way around. There are some other examples that we find in this text, such as clay and clay pots, right? So if I want to know what clay pots are like, and I give you 50 clay pots from China, 50 clay pots from Australia, 50 clay pots from Canada, and I say, go figure out these clay pots, it may take you, who knows, 2 years, maybe 15 years. But instead of studying each one of these clay pots one by one, distinct name, distinct form, distinct attribute, characteristic feature, distinct provenance, range, maker, why do all of that? Why not go straight to the microstructure of clay and look up what clay is or is like, maybe under a microscope, or go and speak to somebody who does material science and say, this is the structure of clay. So by knowing the root, you will know all the branches. By knowing the root, you will know all the branches and the flowers and the twigs and the leaves. So you don't have to start the other way around, inspecting 20,000 flowers, 40,000 leaves, 50,000 twigs and shrubbery and undergrowth, and say, okay, how do we return to the root now? So go straight to the root, be radical in that sense, straight to the root. And if you can figure out the root, you will figure out everything that has come out from the root. So that is what Advaita is trying to tell you, that, in that sense, Advaita is its own kind of radical thinking, like root thinking. And there's go for the root, not for the expression of the product. The expression of the product comes later. And because the expression of the product is, again, not too necessarily the root, by figuring out the root, you can figure out the effect of the product. So that is why they are fond of using this analogy of the sea and the sea waves, or the clay and the clay pots.
Mm-hmm. So in the Advaitic ways of speaking of the world, at least in English, we would hear phrases which we use in the booklet as well. Conventionally true reality and metaphysically true reality, both of which have their Sanskrit equivalents. But I wonder if we could speak through what it is that makes something conventionally true versus metaphysically true. So if we were just to do, as you've already been doing in this call, saying, okay, what do we see around us, right? I see myself, and I think of myself as me, Nadya. I think of you, Ankur. I can, in this conventionally true world, I see us as different. I see us as separate. You were my teacher, I was your student. Now we are here in conversation, two people speaking, right? There are ways that I can see the world. I would also look around me and think, okay, I've got this laptop here. I've got this house plant here. If I look outside my window, I can see other people walking by or driving in their cars. The conventionally true world, or the world of names and forms, namarupa, is how we experience things, right? But Advaita says that there's this whole other truth, this metaphysically true, which is different than what we experience. And it ascribes that difference to Maya. But this is, again, a very, very challenging thing to make sense of. Like, what is it in Advaitic explanations? What is it that is changing things from the conventionally true and the metaphysically true? Like, why do we not see this? Why do we not experience the world as not separate, right? Why do we experience separation?
Yeah, so here what we have to keep in mind that these traditions of Advaita are not just, let's say, quote unquote, intellectual traditions, but these are also what are called pedagogic traditions. And by pedagogic, we mean styles of teaching. So you would, in traditional settings, not come to someone like me, but you would go to a guru in some kind of an ashram or a hermitage, and you would be socialized into a language called Advaita, right? So you would speak a certain language, you would practice certain forms of meditation, you will listen to certain kinds of discourses. So in that sense, Advaita is not like instant coffee, which you put into a microwave with something called the Vedas and the Upanishad and the Gita. In 10 minutes, you get enlightenment, right? So it is, so your mental circuitry needs to be rewired. And this rewiring process proceeds stepwise. And in Advaita, a very strong emphasis is placed on the compassion of the Guru, right? So the Guru has to be compassionate towards you and try to make sense of Advaita to you, right? So, for example, if you come to me as a traditional student, and if I were a traditional teacher, let's say of a certain kind, I could just say, why did you even bother coming to me? Don't you know it's just Advaita everywhere? I mean, just go home and sleep or do something else. There's no need to even study Advaita. It's just there. Right? But if I were to respond to you in that way, there will be no teaching. There will be no communication of, let's say, wisdom. Right? So what I'm going to do as a pedagogic tool, as a teaching device, I'm going to introduce to you this distinction, which is only conceptual, between things which are empirically true or only conventionally true, and things which are ultimately true, absolutely true, right? Now, to understand what I mean when I say a conceptual distinction, but not a real distinction, think about the lens. The concave surface of the lens and the convex surface of the lens can be separated only conceptually. I can literally pull them apart, factually, materially. And I say, convex part, go to the left room, and concave part, go to the right room, right? So this is a distinction we make only conceptually. Likewise, when I say reality can be understood empirically from this side and ultimately from that side, it does not mean that ultimate reality is at the top of Mount Everest and here we are at sea level. It's just one undivided, non-dual, not two reality. But because let's say you and I maybe are not yet fully enlightened gurus or masters, so we have to start where we are. And where are we? We are in the world where multiplicity seems very real. And what Advaita tells you, that multiplicity in itself is not a problem, provided you know you acquire this ability to skillfully turn this multiplicity towards this non-duality, right? And here are some examples that I often use to make sense of this distinction. So the first example is coming up very soon in December. It's called Father Christmas. And we know that Father Christmas or Santa Claus is a fiction. I mean, in the real fabric of the universe, there is no Father Christmas. But it's quite possible that if you have a nephew or a niece, you tell them this lie that there is Father Christmas, and you invite them to do all kinds of things with Santa Claus. Why do you tell them this lie? Why don't you tell them, grow up right from the age of 3? There is no Father Christmas. That's it. The reason why we tell little children, young children, this lie called Santa Claus is because some child psychologists may tell you that the way in which little children acquire certain interpersonal virtues of compassion, kindness, consideration is by playing games with imaginary friends. So children cannot be socialized straight away into the life of grown-ups. So we give them this thing called a useful fiction. It is a fiction because there is no Santa Claus, but that fiction happens to be very useful. And the more you think about this category of a useful fiction, well, I don't know now if I should have told you this. You will start seeing useful fictions everywhere. So let's start. The Canadian dollar, I think that's what it's called in Canada, Canadian dollar, the $20 Canadian dollar is a useful fiction. It is useful because if you are starving, it will buy you bread from a supermarket. But if you travel to India with that, if you are not with an exchange person, it's just a piece of paper. It's no use. It's a fiction. Mm-hmm. Right now, I am using a fiction to you called the English language. It is again useful because hopefully we are talking about Advaita. It is making sense to you. So hopefully it's useful. But it is a fiction if you go to Tibet or some other place where I would have to be speaking in French, which I cannot. So then I will realize, well, it's a fiction. Yeah? And the more you think about it, what is not a fiction then? Right? The fact that you claim to be a student of a university is a useful fiction. It is useful because some point in time it will give you a job of some kind or the other. But ultimately, it is a fiction. I mean, there are no things called universities, the deep structure of reality. For thousands of years, hundreds of years, the cosmos went along fine without universities, without students, without professors. The world in itself did not lose. The world was not saying, "Oh, university, please come along. I'm waiting for you." It's the human social construct, as you say. So Advaita is a constant reminder that all these distinctions, divisions that we construct through our, because of our necessities, which are sometimes very real. You need a visa and a passport to travel to Bolivia or to Australia. So it's useful to have that piece of paper. But again, from deep outer space, you would never guess that there are countries called Bolivia and Australia and this and that you need pieces of paper to move across the globe. These are the human social constructs which we have developed at specific points in time to make life easy, or maybe not. And that is what Advaita is trying to get at. It's a constant reminder, when you use these useful fictions, do not forget that they are as useful as their fictions, and they're as fictions as they're useful. Right? So you have to keep in mind this kind of constant dialectic, this dynamic. If you forget one, then the whole point is lost.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? So in one sense, let's say if I were speaking to you inside an ashram, say for example, this discourse would be a useful fiction. It would be fiction because the I who is speaking to you is a fiction ultimately. So are you, so is the laptop. But it is useful because within the context of the ashram, this is how we are steadily, hopefully, moving towards this enlightenment, to this non-dual, not two-ness state or experience.
Yeah.
So that's the paradox. In case you have watched those movies with what's his name, Keanu Reeves, Matrix, how from within the Matrix you may learn to get out of the Matrix if you meet Morpheus, and then you meet a Neo, right? So the new one who becomes enlightened and moves out of the Matrix, but from where? From within the Matrix. Mm-hmm. So how to use the tools and resources of the Matrix to get out of the Matrix is this paradox that Advaita is trying to get at. How to use the social construct to get to that foundation which lies beyond the social construct.
Yeah. And one thing I want to pick up from what you said in that explanation, Ankur, is that a lot of these teachings of Advaita would happen in different settings. So something I actually said to my students in week 1 or week 2, or probably both weeks, was that there's a really interesting challenge as well as a really wonderful opportunity that comes when we are kind of given a crash course in contemplative practices, Advaita philosophy being one of many weeks we look at, right? Because the thing is, we can learn these things intellectually, we can hear about them, we can be exposed to them, but many of them do not, they're not the instant coffee that you mentioned. That they're not the concepts to which they are referring are not necessarily things that we are going to be able to describe and thus grasp intellectually. They often take experience as a necessary precursor to coming alongside that intellectual understanding. So, if we were to come to Advaita terminologies and Advaitic ways of describing the world after, let's say, having a near-death experience, if we were to look at literature of people who describe a near-death experience, or even many out-of-body experiences, from meditation practices, from substance use, from other external forces that they were not prepared for but compelled them into an out-of-body experience, many people describe this kind of not two-ness that Advaita refers to. They describe this sense of connectedness to others around them. They sometimes even describe the loss of a self. This happens also with people who describe certain types of strokes, at least. I'm thinking of a TED Talk done by Jill Bolte Taylor, Stroke of Insight, where she describes the left hemisphere of her brain being affected by a stroke and her feeling extremely connected to others, but also extremely at loss of who her small sense of self was. When we have these experiences that can be cultivated through meditation practices, which are not often, unless you have a stroke or have another reason to have a very immediate experience of that, they are often things that are slowly cultivated over days, weeks, months, years in a meditative stance in an ashram, maybe. once we have those experiences, some of this vocabulary can begin to make a lot more sense, is what I have found, at least. That when we can couple this intellectual description of nocturneness with our own glimpse, whether that was the 3 seconds when looking at the sunset, whether that was sitting down in seated meditation, whether that was doing kind of a metta, like a loving kindness meditation in which we actively cultivate compassion for ourselves and for others, some of these intellectual descriptions begin to make a little more sense.
And, I mean, it is true. I mean, these vocabularies, these experiences are quite counterintuitive. But again, if you begin to reflect on how we live our lives, even when, or maybe especially when we have never studied Advaita, we will already hear some echoes of Advaita nocturneness. Say, here's one example. When are we at our most creative best? If I keep on saying, look at me, I'm creating this work of art, I am the one who's painting this amazing thing, or I am the one who's writing this amazing novel, the product is possibly not going to be good. But let's say for 5 hours sometimes, maybe, or at least 15 minutes, I become so completely absorbed or lost on the canvas in front of me, or on the laptop in front of me, or the music I'm trying to compose, that I don't even realize I'm the creator, or I'm the composer, or I'm the painter or the author. So I am the work. So that again is the nocturneness of creativity. Like, I mean, creativity emerges when it springs from this basic nocturneness between the creator and the created, between the person who's trying to produce a work of art and the work of art out there. So that the work of art out there is not really out there; it's also in here as much as out there. This kind of, again, nocturneness between who I am as the artist and the work of art. So the point being that I mean, those of us who do some kind of creative work, whatever it may be, it does not have to be writing or reading a book. It could be sailing a boat. It could be riding a bicycle in the mountains. It could be painting. It could be anything. It is just when that I becomes suspended or is put under eraser, then we feel so much full of energy. It is precisely when the I disappears into the background that paradoxically we come into our own. Right? As long as the I remains in the foreground, there is something is blocking us. Something is blocking our pathway to the world. But when the I becomes suspended, then really we become I for the first time. Right? And that again, that paradox that I become I when I am able to get out of my I is again just nocturneness.
Mm.
I mean, now that we are talking about this in this language, it may seem very abstract and abstruse. But what I'm pointing to is, as I say, when you are bicycling in the mountains, you don't realize that you are bicycling.
Yeah. Yeah, there are moments where we lose ourselves, of course. And if we were to interview artists who have made some of the most profound songs that we continue to listen to on repeat, we would hear echoes of people saying, like, the song just kind of came to me, right? There's not this kind of grueling task behind it. And yeah, there can be a loss of that that sense of the small self and then absorption into a bigger self in these moments of pure creativity, of vast, profound reflection and creation. Yeah. Thank you so much for speaking with me, letting our students listen in on all of your insights and knowledge about Hinduism broadly and Advaita specifically. It's great to have you, Ankur, so thank you so much. The final question I have that I would invite your opinions, your reflections, your glimpses of your own experience on is, so my class is called the Introduction to Contemplative Well-Being. And there's thus, some kind of understanding that there must be a relationship of some type between contemplation and well-being. And I wondered if you could just speak on that from your own experience or your own opinion. How is the relationship between contemplation or contemplative practices, even if you want to choose one in particular, and well-being? How do they actually relate to each other?
Yeah, so when it comes to contemplation, we would possibly usually think of contemplation in a very spiritual sense, which is okay, because many of these contemplative aspects, dimensions, traditions are deeply religious, spiritual. They are very deeply interwoven into, say, Islam or forms of Hinduism, forms of Christianity. But in my own personal life, I think the contemplation that has really mattered a lot to me are certain secular forms of contemplation. I mean, these secular forms, again, could have deeper spiritual roots. That's a different matter. But in some straightforward sense, they are not necessarily religious or spiritual. And these two are mainly reading books and listening to music. When I read a book that I really find deeply interesting, and I'm engaging with the book, it usually does not take me more than 5 minutes to go into the zone, as we put it, right? I'm there in 5 minutes, in the zone, when I don't realize that I am reading a book, turning the page, right? The book is speaking to me, I'm speaking to the book. It's a conversation which goes on for, let's say, about 45 minutes till I get an email or I know I have to go to a lecture. And then the other one is I listen to a lot of music. Some of this is Indian classical and sometimes Western classical. And again, when I'm listening to a piece of music which I really like, it hardly takes me any time to kind of get it. So, if it is a song that I can myself sing even better or have heard many times, these forms of contemplation, whether you call them secular or ultimately spiritual, is a different debate. These forms of contemplation, they have given me some kind of stability and coherence to a kind of routine or pattern to my day, right? So there's a reason for how I live my life and how I spend different times of the day, these different intervals, which are connected through these forms of contemplation, which go on. Reading is something that, for better or for worse, I have to do all the time, almost all the time. But whenever I take a break, it's also music. So how much of well-being that is, well, that is another interesting question. But at least in my own estimate, that is some well-being.
Thank you so much for sharing with us.